Missouri adds another big athletic body, but this move didn't move the recruiting rankings very much. I'll explain why I'm not overly concerned, at least not yet.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, well, continuing my strength of schedule discussion from last week, I have some listeners questioning, hey, what is even the predictive value of strength of schedule when no games have even been played yet? It's a good question. I'm going to address it here later in the program. First, I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. And you know what? Actually, I want to get started with some positive news on the Ben Askren front here. In fact, Amy Askren, Ben's wife, of course, Ben, the former Missouri great wrestler, one of the great athletes in Tiger history, well, had come under some real health concerns here recently. Had gotten pneumonia, I believe a staph infection as well, a very serious bout of pneumonia that had left Ben needing a lung transplant. Well, just recently, his wife, Amy, put on her Facebook account, quote, "We are so thankful to share that Ben has received a double lung transplant. We are forever thankful to the donor and his family. This is the beginning of a new lifestyle for Ben, but every new day he has is a gift. It still doesn't feel real that he was walking around completely healthy just 5 weeks ago. So much can change so quickly. Please keep Ben in your prayers that his body welcomes the new lungs as if they were his own. I am constantly in awe of all the people carrying us through right now. I can't wait to tell Ben about it. I'm hopeful that in the coming weeks, Ben will be able to give the next update, but hopefully he will wait until the drugs wear off." So a little humor even at the end there from Amy Askren. So what an incredibly positive update, an optimistic update there, because it really was sounding rough there for Ben Askren in the most recent update. So this is an incredibly positive note here, and obviously going to keep Ben in our thoughts and prayers. But on to a more fun topic, which is Eli Drinkwitz landing another high school recruit. This time it's Brandon Anderson, an offensive lineman who had been committed to Tennessee for some time, had backed off of that commitment, and was still considering the Vols pretty strongly, reportedly. But he chose the Missouri Tigers yesterday over Tennessee, over Bill Belichick and Jordan Hudson's North Carolina program. And by the way, Georgia and Alabama kicked the tires as well. So to me, we're going to talk a little bit more about star ratings here in just a minute, but just generally speaking, I'm much more interested in who is going after you than I am who your star, what your star rankings you got from a high school ranker, no matter how good that person may or may not be at their job. Well, I'll just say this, as I said about the previous lineman that Missouri signed in this class. To me, when it comes to offensive linemen, it's all about just getting the high upside bodies, and I think that's what Missouri has done here. You want to get guys who are 6'5", 6'6", 313 pounds in high school, by the way. It's much more preferable than, say, getting a young man who's that tall but needs to put on 40, 30, 50 pounds of weight to compete at the SEC level. To me, the guys who are ready and able and comfortable at carrying around that type of weight, well, those people are few and far between. So as many of them as Missouri can stack, well, the better you are. And I think Brandon Jones, by the way, a good offensive line coach, I think you just have to trust him to be able to develop those guys. It's really as simple as that. Now, when it comes to the bigger picture. And you look at Missouri's high school recruiting rankings here so far, and I think a lot of Missouri fans are understandably a little bit concerned because the high school rankings are quite simply lagging significantly behind right now for the 2026 high school class, that is, versus the previous few seasons, including just last year when Missouri had the 20th ranked high school class. That's according to On3.com. But this season, again, Missouri was 20th last season. We've seen some classes inside the top 15 in recent years. Well, this year so far, and it is important to point out, so far the Tigers are not even inside the top 50 of the high school rankings over at On3 and are ranked second to last, notably in the SEC, only ahead of Auburn. And by the way, that's not just a quantity thing either. And yes, Missouri only has 8 signees thus far. Many other programs have as many as twice that number. But it's also quality-based as well. If you simply look at the average star rankings of this class, well, you'd put the class maybe 13th or 12th instead of 15th, but still a long way from the top half of the conference and also a long way, just as importantly, from where Eli Drinkwitz has sort of raised the bar here at Missouri the last few seasons. Now, at this point, it's important, of course, to realize and to point out that high school rankings are far from gospel. This 2026 class could end up being a great class for Missouri. Obviously, time will tell about how good the players that Missouri already has in the fold, how many flips there are going to be, and, of course, the guys that Missouri signs to I'm guessing there's probably going to be another 7 or 8 guys in this class. So to me, before we start to panic about high school rankings, because I don't want one year to necessarily be a trend, but as far as I can tell, the real takeaway here is that Missouri is quite clearly spending more of its resources on the transfer portal in this cycle. And you look at, well, the 2025 cycle, the cycle that's going to be putting guys on the field this year, guys like quarterback Bo Prabula, Damon Wilson on the edge on defense. Well, On3 has that as the 7th best portal cycle in the entire country. So 7th versus not even in the top 50 currently in the high school rankings. That tells me that Missouri is putting its resources and, well, put more simply, its money into the transfer portal side. What I think is going to be interesting to see is if Missouri's portal ranking, what is that going to be in 2026? Because obviously these lower ranked high school additions that Missouri has, again, who knows what will happen in the future and how good these guys will be. Plenty of examples just in Missouri history of guys coming way off the radar. Think Charles Harris, think Sean Weatherspoon, Denario Alexander, guys who are really far off of the radar who ended up having NFL type of careers. So a lot is to be said here, but it's safe to say that this class is probably focusing a little bit more on potential over production. And when it comes to the allocation of resources, especially in this new environment we're about to enter, I think that makes a lot of sense. Because now that there's going to be a revenue share, essentially, well, not only does that change that, hey, there's going to be money coming directly from these college programs themselves, but for all intents and purposes, this is now a salary cap. Now, of course, the powers that be are careful not to call it that. You can call it whatever you want. I just think that for the modern sports fan, a salary cap is a phrase that we're all very familiar with, and I think it describes what's actually happening pretty accurately. So I think in that light, I think what Missouri's doing here is saying, well, hey, Drinkwitz's thing is I want production over potential. Well, the guys that you're getting out of high school who are going to have immediate production, at least presumably, that's the assumption, right? Those guys are going to cost you an arm and a leg, and they may not stick around very long. Think Williams Winery, for example. So it does make a lot more sense. If you're looking for production over potential, well, your hit rate is going to be a heck of a lot higher in the transfer portal than it is with these high school ranks. I would also point out that Missouri, like a lot of other schools, decided to front load a lot of these latest NIL transfer portal deals to get up ahead of revenue sharing. In other words, a lot of these kids like Bo Prabula and Damon Wilson, well, they weren't just getting it an equal chunk every month like maybe some of the guys in the past. In fact, they're getting the lion's share of their money up front to get ahead of the latest revenue share, the latest revenue share deadline, to put it quite simply. So a lot of moving parts here. Once again, the landscape is just constantly changing here in college football. But once again, I'll just say this. I think at this point, I'm not really all that worried about Missouri's high school football recruiting rankings, because I think this is looking like more of a shift in strategy and a shift in the allocation of resources than anything else. I think what's the most important thing to look at in the future, even more so than what does the 26 high school class look like at the end of the day, what is it going to look like in 2026, Missouri's portal class? Because if suddenly Missouri's not in the top 5, top 10, even top 15 or top 20, and it's suddenly, well, their portal class is looking more like what the high school class is looking like this year, that is truly the moment to hit a big, giant red panic button. But until then, I'm going to take it easy and take it in stride. Oh, and by the way, as you can tell if you're watching on YouTube, we are fewer than 60 days from Mizzou football, the kickoff of the 2025 season. And with all that said, of course, no games have been played yet. So what is the deal with all this strength of schedule talk? How can we even talk about the strength of schedule when no games have played yet, especially with all this roster turnover? Is there any predictive value to this stuff? Well, let's talk about all that in just a little bit. But I'll tell you this, if you've got some predictive value on baseball, you got to head over to FanDuel, because summer sports are in full swing. And whether you're all about baseball, maybe golf, perhaps some soccer as well, FanDuel's the best way to make the games even more interesting. And with FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. And, well, obviously baseball is what most of my listeners are into these days. You got the St. Louis Cardinals in Pittsburgh this evening. The Royals are in Seattle tonight. Boy, the Royals need to start hitting the baseball a little better if we have any chance to make the playoffs. I'll promise you that. But maybe you like the Cardinals to get a win, -106 tonight against the Pittsburgh Pirates. Regardless of what you're into, if you're into FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. So for all the talk, and we're going to get a lot more of it more than likely, hopefully we do, honestly, because if people are still talking about Missouri's strength of schedule in football in 2025, if they're still talking about it into September and October and November, that actually means Missouri's probably having a good season. So on one hand, let's hope this talk continues. On the other hand, I think it's kind of silly in a way, because I think Missouri's schedule, while relatively easy in the SEC, is still certainly difficult enough that you win 10 games, that'll get the Tigers into the college football playoff. I think that was true last season. I think that will be true once again with more or less a very similar schedule. In fact, maybe a little bit more difficult on paper with Kansas. I don't know, Kansas versus BC last season. I guess your mileage may vary there. But just a fan of sports on YouTube, one of my most loyal everydayers, I would say. He always brings a lot of good questions, so I want to answer one right now. He says, how exactly do you determine strength of schedule before a season even starts? Everyone's rosters look so different year to year with the portal. I mean, SOS gets a little more accurate as each week goes by during the actual season, but preseason, pretty worthless in my opinion. Well, there was a lot there, and the only thing that I will slightly disagree with there is the comment at the end where he says pretty worthless in my opinion. First of all, yes, no doubt there's a lot of assumptions being made in the preseason with all types of projections, whether it's strength of schedule or anything else. Essentially, your strength of schedule projections are basically just compiling your projections and saying, well, if this team has this projection, this team has that projection, I think they'll win by about 8 points, for example, that type of deal. Now, again, a ton of assumptions there. Injuries, a million different types of things can factor into all of these things. And of course, to this listener's point, to just a fan of sports point, yeah, with the transfer portal, I think that actually makes projecting forward even more difficult in college football than it was in the past. But again, to that point, is it actually worthless though? Because that's where I would push back, because even though this may seem counterintuitive, hey, we don't actually know anything about these teams coming up. But if you think about the history of college football, it's a pretty safe bet to say, for example, that I think Missouri is going to be better than UMass this season, who is on Missouri's schedule. Now, what am I basing that on? Well, mostly just recent history and, well, frankly, all of college football history. But not only projections, but an actual result last season. Missouri beat down UMass pretty hard. But even if you took a team, for example, like Kansas, who Missouri didn't play last season, well, I don't think it's absurd to project forward that Missouri would be better than Kansas for this upcoming season. Missouri has had better seasons in recent history, and by the way, the projections certainly factor this in as well. They've been much better over the last 10 to 15 years or so, when Kansas has been maybe the worst Power 4 or 5 program in all of college football, at least until their last coach. That's for darn sure. Since Lance Leopold, they've gotten a little better. But the point here is that, hey, to say, well, Alabama is probably going to be better than Kansas this season. Sure, technically, absolutely. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe Kansas will be better than Alabama this season. Maybe they'll have a better record. But does anybody think that me saying that that's just a coin flip? I don't think we can really say that at this point. Does that make sense? What I'm saying is that what college football has told us throughout history is that, in fact, probably the easiest way to predict how many games, how the quality of a team in the future is how good it was in the past. Teams like Alabama and Georgia, Oklahoma, of course, gets a lot of benefit of the doubt still despite their last season, whereas Vanderbilt gets a lot less benefit of the doubt, again, because, well, they had a decent season last year and beat Alabama, but recent history tells us that Vanderbilt isn't going to be as good of a quality as Alabama. I just don't think that is a controversial statement whatsoever. Maybe all of college football is going to flip on its head with this revenue sharing deal, and a bunch of other factors in the future will change things. But so far, I think the data is pretty compelling. And in fact, these projection systems, while they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, are a heck of a lot more valuable than just having nothing whatsoever. And speaking of Vanderbilt, well, let's do some stadium updates on a Missouri opponent, and of course, Missouri as well. I've got some questions about those stadium renovations on Faurot Field, and I'll talk about that right after these quick words. And a lot of you have been enjoying the Faurot Field facelift updates I've been putting on my social media accounts at Locked On Mizzou, and also on YouTube as well. The YouTube Shorts is where those particular videos are going. And you know what? I'll probably get you one pretty soon. There's been a lot of significant progress here in the last couple weeks or so. So definitely going to get another one for you here in the coming days. But listener Samantha, by the way, a coveted 4%er, by the way, one of those people who enjoyed my updates. Another one, Vol Tiger, says, John, I have a question. I'm pretty locked in I see what you did there. When it comes to Mizzou football, the one thing I have not seen any talk about is, will there be a Rock M this season at Memorial Stadium? Well, I got to say, I'm unclear on that. If I had to guess, I'm guessing there will not be a Rock M in 2025, but I cannot say for sure. That's looking like that's going to be an ongoing construction site, certainly, specifically the area right in front of more or less the ongoing. It just seems to me that's going to be a real long shot to imagine there's any type of temporary Rock M happening in 2025, but 2026, yeah, there's definitely going to be another Rock M for sure. The hill is going to be smaller in the future for sure, so perhaps it'll look a little bit cramped at first. I'm sure we're going to get used to it. All I know is there's definitely going to be a Rock M eventually when Missouri finishes the stadium upgrades in the north end zone in 2026. So my colleagues Stephen Willis and Zach Blackerby, who seem far too fascinated on this topic, can rest their little heads and hearts very easily. Another listener, P5 Cowdrey, asks, has Vanderbilt finished their stadium upgrades this season? Well, my Magic 8 Ball is saying that they will. It looks like the Commodores are on schedule to have their renovations finished. The final touches, I should say. There was a Phase 1, and now it looks like Phase 2 is going to be completed here by the start of the 2025 season. So if you're thinking about heading down to Nashville for the game between the Tigers and the Commodores this season, well, I would definitely encourage you to do so. The stadium looks like it's going to be finished and ready to go by kickoff. And finally, you may have seen that Missouri, well, joining maybe a little bit late on this trend, but joining the trend nonetheless of the LED light show, turning it off, turning it on, all that good stuff. I experienced this phenomenon firsthand at Williams-Brice Stadium last year for the South Carolina game. I can't say I'm against it, but at the same time, Missouri feels a little bit late on the trend here. I'll just say this. Mizzou Arena, in my opinion, have you seen all of the railing lighting that became all the rage this season in the NBA? It seemed like every arena, especially once the Clipper Dome, the Intuit Dome, I believe is the actual name, where the Los Angeles Clippers now play, a very impressive arena. But it seems like everybody has lighting on their railings throughout the arena, and I'm just not really sure what that's adding to me. I think that's an unnecessary bit of money that Missouri doesn't really need to spend. I'd rather spend it on a long snapper than lighting. That's just me. But maybe you have a different opinion. I'd love to hear your opinions. As always, of course, hit me up on social media at Locked On Mizzou or lockedonmizzou@gmail.com. And thanks for making this show your first listen. For your second listen, check out the portal. Brian Smith, the Scout Master, has the latest rumors, portal happenings, etc. You got to be the most informed fan on the rapid changes in college football. Find the portal on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, I'm John Miller. This has been Locked On Mizzou.